universe, control the environment, even time. Scientists have picked up where occult practitioners have left off and sought to solve mysteries that the magicians had long tried to understand. March 17, 1863. John Pelham leads his company into the Battle of Kelly's Ford on a field in Virginia. Pelham was famed for his courage, but this was to be his final battle. More than a century later in Chicago, Illinois, Margaret Barrett feels a searing pain in her head. Could this nurse from the Midwest and a Civil War major have some connection? Margaret believes she was the major in a past life.
When people have an experience of a past life, the truth is unshakable. It's a self-evident truth, and anybody could doubt the existence of that past life. But the people who have had the experience, you're not going to shake that truth from them. They know.
Most believe otherwise, but men like Isaac Newton, Galileo, Carl Jung are responsible for creating some of science's biggest breakthroughs that were once considered mystical.
Now, how do you know some of the things we now regard as supernatural and inconceivable may turn out to be perfectly valid, legitimate science 50 years from now?
Ever since the Renaissance, scientists have pushed far beyond accepted boundaries. Before the age of technology, scientists relied on belief and intuition. The original occultists believed the universe was a field of consciousness that they could access to decipher the work of the gods.
We think we are separate from each other. We're actually just part of one great universe. And that was a kind of core idea that the occult magicians had. They expressed it beautifully at one point by saying, as above, so below. It really means that wherever you look, the patterns will be the same at the microscopic level, at our level, and at the cosmic level.
These magicians believed that the universe and the mind were linked, a connection that quantum physicists are still trying to prove.
And people find this very exciting, the overlay between the way the brain works and the way the universe works.
But other New Age practices like channeling and exploring past lives are not accepted.
All these experiences that are claimed to be occult sometimes originate in the brain from brain pathology. And this makes you wonder about all of these phenomena, what's causing them. Just because you find that people with temporal lobe seizures experience God doesn't negate the idea of God. But it does make you wonder, what religious experience is all about, because there are neural structures in the brain that predispose you to religious belief and mysticism.
The link between magic and science has always been strong. And once the mystical is proven, it can become scientific fact. It's a pursuit that has shaped the world and man's understanding of it from the time of Newton. Isaac Newton was born in the 17th century, when man still believed the cosmos revolved around the earth. He is known both as the father of modern science and the last of the great magicians.
Newton was an extraordinary intellect. He was able to concentrate for endless hours, and sometimes it seemed days on an issue. He could keep in mind all of the parts.
Newton vividly imagined his theories and only later backed them up with experiments, a practice now known as an altered state of consciousness.
People can do this by running or exercising. People can do it by fasting. People can do it by drinking or drugging. People can do it by prayer or meditation. There are many hypnotism. There are many venerable practices over thousands of years where people have altered their state of consciousness.
Well, I think creativity really requires something like the acceptance of intuition, acceptance of inspiration as the starting point for ideas that turn out to be profound, important, and even scientific ideas. If you open yourself to the cosmos, you will be filled with new knowledge.
Newton was trying to build on the theories of a man who died in 1642, the same year he was born, Galileo. Galileo was mapping the stars and the planets. By then, astrology was a centuries-old science.
In the ancient mystery schools, and let's say Egyptians as well as Pythagoreans, Their aim would have been to connect to the gods and implore them to do something, and then the gods, being powerful, would do the thing.
Galileo was not trying to contact the gods. He was trying to explain their work. During the Renaissance, scientists followed the teachings of Aristotle. The work of this 3rd century BC Greek were the theories accepted by the Catholic Church.
The idea of motion was extremely different from what we presently understand. The notion was that every kind of object or substance had its natural place, with earth at the bottom and then water, air, and fire, and the quintessence that the heavens were made of above that, and that objects tended to remain in their natural places, and that to move them you needed to push on them continuously.
He also taught that the Earth was the center of the solar system and that a heavy object would fall faster than a lighter one. These were accepted truths until Galileo. Galileo confirmed that the Earth revolved around the sun. Aristotle believed that matter falls because it knows its place in the cosmos. The hand of its creator guides it to return to its place of origin. Galileo's understanding of gravity was much more advanced, and he used scientific method to prove his theories.
Aristotle was a great thinker, believed that heavy objects fall much faster than light objects. And he needed 5 minutes to test this. All he needed was 5 minutes to go up in a building, take a rock, take a pea, and drop them at the same time. He never did. And the reason is the concept of an experiment is alien to the human mind.
But not to Galileo. He did the experiment and found that they fell at the same rate.
So this is why we think Galileo was a great genius, because he said, we can ask questions about nature, not have preconceived notions. We can start with an open mind and say, what happens when you drop a big stone in a tiny pea? And lo and behold, he found something counterintuitive, which anybody can test and verify.
Galileo thoroughly discredited the sacred Aristotelian worldview of the Church and paid dearly for it. The cardinals of the Inquisition rejected his theories. He kept publishing, and for his efforts, he was found guilty of heresy. Galileo was placed under house arrest in 1633 and spent the rest of his life under the Inquisition's watchful eye. It took 350 years for the Church to admit that they were wrong. By then, Newton had confirmed Galileo's conclusions.
Isaac Newton was fascinating. He was born on Christmas Day. He was a widow's son. He was raised in a kind of austere surroundings and went off to college and kind of never stopped being at college, and studied the rest of his life. From a young man, he studied everything there was in the universe to study.
The Renaissance had been fueled by the rediscovery of long-lost early Greek and occult texts. Scholars like Newton were thrilled to discover new ideas in science, religion, and magic. Newton was not only a scientist, he was an avowed alchemist.
Most of the brilliant people in history, and Isaac Newton was one of them, went into alchemy, went into various occult pursuits because they wanted to find out how things work, and they were willing to go as far as they needed to satisfy their inquisitive minds.
In Newton's time, there was no hard distinction between magic, spirituality, and science. Scientists used any method to expand their knowledge. He spent years searching for the crown jewel of alchemy, the philosopher's stone. The stone was not an actual gem, but a higher level of consciousness that would enable scientific and spiritual breakthroughs. Alone in his room with his alchemical experiments, Newton would go for days without food or sleep.
People who study creativity say there are several stages. First, you have to learn a great deal, and then you have to let that incubate and kind of bubble inside you, and then it will turn into something like an inspiration. That's what the alchemists were trying to do as well, and what Newton did so successfully.
Newton took on Galileo's challenge of refuting Aristotle. When he applied his mind to Aristotle's theory of falling objects in the orbit of the planets, he made the most important discovery of physics: gravity. It was groundbreaking,
When Newton thought about gravity, he had to conceive of the idea that two bodies can attract each other at a distance. And even today, we have trouble figuring out how that happens. I mean, how is it that the sun knows that Jupiter is there? Who knows?
The emerging breed of empirical scientists were very uncomfortable with the whole idea that something could affect another object without touching it, without being connected to it in some way. Then we have Newton coming in with this mathematical theory that accounts perfectly for astronomical observations, but it requires there to be a force between these two different objects, and there's nothing in between. So he was basically stuck with action at a distance, no matter how uncomfortable it made him or anybody else.
Newton was also the first to discover the properties of light and believed that light was composed of particles.
Aristotle's worldview didn't accept the idea of atoms, of indivisible components of objects. But it's clear from, for instance, Newton's writings on light that he had some definite ideas along those lines, that he thought of light as being a stream of tiny, rapidly moving particles of some sort, corpuscles, as he wrote.
In 1687, Newton published his masterwork, Principia, and he became an international sensation. In it, he set down his three laws of motion: the law of inertia, the relationship between force and motion, and his final rule: for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Even though Newton had explained the universe, emotional difficulties would affect his work. The end of the 17th century brought important scientific advancement. Sir Isaac Newton had made an epic contribution to this revolution, but in 1675, he had a nervous breakdown.
He had a number of things that happened to him all at once. He became depressed and holed up in his apartment and couldn't be brought out. He had to be dragged out of there by his friends. The legend goes that he had been practicing actual alchemy with chemistry, and that the fumes may have made him somewhat crazy or psychotic. There's all kinds of ways to read that, and he might have had simply a nervous breakdown.
Newton never made another scientific breakthrough, but his work would endure. In the 1660s, a specter from the past haunted London, the Black Plague. 70,000 people died. Then the Great Fire. But in the midst of this turmoil, a scientific first. In 1660, an elite group of British scientists formed the Royal Society, history's first organization devoted to the pursuit of science.
The Royal Society started out sort of as a smart guys club, where they got together and discussed every conceivable topic that was, probably a little risque, of course, because at various times, England was in the throes of religious clampdowns.
The threat of the church did not stop them. Newton himself would lead the Royal Society for 24 years. He is said to have uttered just one sentence during all those meetings. He asked for the window to be opened. But his near mystical focus would inspire another generation to look for the universe within, the human brain. On its surface, a well-tuned machine of neurons and nerves perfectly synchronized for movement, learning, even defense. But there is more to the brain than just electric impulses. This remarkable organ contains people's thoughts, their past. Some would say it holds the soul. Newton's discovery of gravity transformed the way science understood the universe. But another member of the Royal Society, Thomas Willis, was about to overturn Aristotle in a different field, medicine. Willis began the first scientific exploration of the brain and its elusive software, the mind.
Thomas Willis was an English physician, and he figured out how to study the brain, which was a tough thing to do because the brain would dissolve in mere hours after death.
Progress in medicine had been hampered by a long-standing taboo against dissection of the human body.
It took a certain relaxation of the rules to ever get dissection to happen. A lot of times the practitioners were in fact criminals. They were declared to be criminals even though they were scientists. It was against the law and every other thing to dissect the human body.
Until the Renaissance, doctors believed Aristotle's view that the heart was the home of the mind. Few in medicine were able to conceive that the shapeless white mass inside the skull could possibly be the seat of reason and artistic expression. Willis suspected that the brain held more than his colleagues assumed.
So he figured out a way to preserve it and then was able to distinguish all of the parts of the brain which nobody had really come to grips with before.
Like Newton, Willis was an alchemist willing to experiment to get to the truth. Willis was the first to dissect the nerves leading to the brain. He explained how they functioned together. His lectures held his audiences spellbound. In 1664, he published Cerebrae Anatomy, at the time the most comprehensive study of the brain. A young student named John Locke built on his work and investigated the nature of thinking itself. Locke was primarily a philosopher. In 1660, he published his Essay Concerning Human Understanding, distancing himself from Aristotle.
Locke really challenged the Aristotelian notion that ideas were innate in the human mind, and instead focused on the development of ideas and the developmental process and the ways the brain apprehended the universe. It was really one of the first efforts to describe a neuroscience and what the brain actually does.
Neuroscience became a new discipline that is still full of mystery.
I think it's true that there's the brain, there are neurons firing, and there's the mind. Okay, but regarding the mind itself, we have barely scratched the surface of how it works. What do you mean by creativity? What do you mean by consciousness? What do you mean by self-awareness?
Scientists now understand how much of the brain works inside the skull, but are still trying to discover how the mind can affect the world outside of its casing. In Paris, medical astrologer Franz Anton Mesmer stumbled almost by accident upon hypnosis. At the time, Mesmer was experimenting with magnets as a means of curing illness.
Well, Franz Mesmer would have people sit in a tub, and he used magnets with these tubs, and it was often referred to as anomagnetism, which is interesting because magnets have recycled again today, and medical doctors are using electromagnetism as a way of healing.
Mesmer first believed that the magnets exerted the invisible force of animal magnetism. Later, he thought that the force emanated from within him, and he abandoned the magnets. In actuality, Mesmer had only rediscovered another lost occult art. The first induced hypnotic performance, recorded on papyrus in a British museum, was given at the court of Khufu in Egypt over 5,000 years ago. Later, seers at the Greek oracle of Delphi used self-hypnosis to foresee the future.
Modern hypnosis, as practiced in the United States, begins with Franz Mesmer. But if you go back even further, every culture has a way of going into a trance. It could be using music, it could be using dance, it could be sitting in meditation.
His treatment became popular in the 1770s, and Mesmer's fame quickly spread as scores of patients claimed themselves cured through mesmerism.
He was able to put people in a trance and suggest to them things that were good, like getting better, like healing. He became famous for that, and they actually had to have a committee of scientists, and that was actually Ben Franklin was one of the committee who tried to decide whether anything about this was real or not. They said, well, mesmerism works, but we think it works because of the imagination. Not some other operative principle.
Mesmer was dismissed by many as a quack, but in 1843, London surgeon John Elliotson began using what he called the mesmerizing coma to perform major surgery without pain. Anesthesia had yet to be invented, and Elliotson's technique resulted in more than 300 successful operations. Mesmer's influence was short-lived. With the discovery of ether, hypnosis was once again dismissed by traditional medicine.
So rather than pick up on the idea that our beliefs can help us heal and help us recover, it discounted the work of Mesmer.
But he had laid the foundation for modern hypnosis, a practice that is now accepted as a form of treatment by the medical establishment. Hypnosis relies on suggestibility, imagination.
Our bodies can't distinguish between a real and imagined experience. For example, there was a recent study done with anger and heart disease. How researchers got people angry is they had them imagine situations that made them angry. And so just as they imagined themselves angry, their body responded as if they were actually had reason, cause to be angry, and there was a change that they were able to identify. But the real beauty of this experiment was the power of the imagination. Our imaginations can make us angry, or our imaginations can make us happy and peaceful. Whether we're angry or whether we're happy is our choice.
An entire field of alternative medicine has developed that utilizes imagining techniques to promote healing.
There are over 22 studies done on visualization and cancer healing. 18 of those studies conclusively shows visualization helps fight cancer.
It's no surprise. Obviously, the brain regulates our bodily functions. So if you could influence the brain, either through meditation, through developing certain frequencies of brain waves, through introducing images and ideas, of course you're going to be able to have an effect on the materiality of disease and the efficacy of medicine.
Scientists have thoroughly studied the phenomenon, but remain unsure why and how it works.
There are two criteria when you encounter a new phenomenon. One is, does it fit the big picture of what we know in science or about the mind, right? Two is it repeatable? Hypnosis is rejected for the first reason, which is not a good reason to reject something. Namely, how does it fit into what we understand about the brain and mind? What is this hypnosis business? How can you enter somebody else's mind and make him wiggle his hand or do silly things? It doesn't make any sense. Reject it. But the second criterion, repeatability. It's very repeatable. You can do it on hundreds of people. And that's been staring at us for over 100 years. We know it's a perfectly valid, legitimate phenomenon. We just don't have an explanation for it.
Before Mesmer, doctors had struggled for centuries to understand the problems they saw in their patients that could not be explained with existing medical science. Conditions like insanity and hysteria were treated using a vast array of misguided cures, from leeches to exorcisms.
Things like what we now call schizophrenia or depression, those kinds of things looked like some kind of infection by demons.
No one ever thought the brain could be their source. Locke's essay on human understanding gave rise to a new science, psychology. In 1885, a 29-year-old Viennese doctor named Sigmund Freud was struggling to cure the hysteria he encountered in many of his female patients. Freud had begun his medical career researching the nervous system, but nothing in accepted science could help his patients. In 1885, humanity was on the move. Carl Benz has created the first gasoline-powered vehicle. But Dr. Sigmund Freud was running into a brick wall, trying to help solve the emotional problems of his patients. Then he tried hypnosis. He put his patients under and found that they remembered past traumas. Physicists had recently developed a new understanding about energy, that it could not be destroyed, only transformed. Freud was inspired by their work.
He was brilliant, he was opinionated, and he was a pretty good learner. So he was looking around and he saw the systemized knowledge that was coming into force in what was called natural science, eventually became physics. He just lifted those metaphors out, put them into the psyche.
Freud discovered the unconscious. Freud saw the human personality as a psychic energy system. Energy that was not expressed consciously was diverted into the patient's unconscious, where it created neurosis. Freud identified repressed sexual energy as the root cause of all mental illness.
And his ideas are still very much in force. We still think about our deepest motivations being hidden and supplanted by replacement motives and so forth. That's a Freudian extrapolation of the physics model into a psychic domain.
Freud invented psychoanalysis as a method for releasing the sexual traumas buried in the unconscious. This was the new frontier of the study of consciousness. And though much of Freud's work would eventually fall out of favor, his work provided the foundation for modern psychology. The conservative Freud would never have identified himself as an occultist, but one of his followers would prove to be both a pioneer in the field and an occult practitioner.
He wanted to know everything about everything. He read everything. He traveled to Africa. He traveled to India. He traveled to America. He was somebody who had a voracious appetite for experience and for trying to understand the psyche in all times and places and all locations on the globe.
Carl Jung was born 10 years before Freud invented psychoanalysis. The son of a minister, Jung conducted experiments in spiritualism. He became a psychologist to explore the dimensions of the mind, but never lost his lifelong fascination with the occult. His hero, Freud, became both a mentor and his nemesis.
He didn't meet Freud until 1907, and when they met, they spoke for 13 hours straight. And one of the things that came up was the occult. Jung had been a defender of Freud's sexual theory of hysteria before they met. He'd been a public defender of that, but he didn't believe the sexual theory explained everything. And when he sat with Freud during this 13-hour thing, Freud got a very, very serious expression on his face and looked at Jung and said, you must promise me one thing, dear son. You must promise never to abandon the sexual theory and make of it a dogma and unshakable bulwark against the black tide of mud. And then he hesitated and said, of occultism.
Jung refused to believe that sexual repression explained everything, and he was not about to give up the occult. But Freud made certain that Jung paid a price.
Jung was, at the time of his break with Freud, he was president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. And Freud did not want to leave Jung in charge of the whole shop. And so behind the scenes, in what you might call an occult practice, he formed a little committee, and he gave each one of them a little signet ring, and he swore them all to secrecy, and they began to plot in a kind of conspiratorial way about how to get rid of Carl Jung.
After the break with Freud, Jung spiraled into a 6-year depression. He retreated to his country house in Bollingen. Like Newton so many centuries before, he went in search of his own philosopher's stone.
Jung constructed a tower at Bollingen, and he built it in some sense by his own hand, and he carved various kinds of stones out there with mystical figures on them, and he cooked on a primitive little stove with wood there. He chopped wood outside. He went down to the lake. He slept on a cot. It was a kind of retreat where he could go and introvert and have his own psychological experiences.
He struggled with his own depression and emerged with a new kind of psychology, one that was steeped in mystic thought.
He used tarot cards, he used astrology, but more importantly, whether it be tarot cards or astrology, Carl Jung believed in the intuition. Carl Jung once said, the therapist's job is to get his or her patient in touch with the intuition, and when the therapist has done that, the job is basically done.
During his retreat, Jung concluded that astrology, alchemy, mythology, and the I Ching were ways the first magicians understood the human consciousness. His biggest breakthrough, he saw the psyche as an energy field far bigger than a single personality. He called this the collective unconscious.
The collective unconscious includes all the things that are not personal to us, that transcend that. They're the transpersonal or impersonal contents of the unconscious that Jung called archetypes. They're the typically human components that don't have anything to do with us necessarily just personally. They're not about our personal experiences. It's not about our mother or our father. It's about the very idea of mother and father.
Both Jung and Freud practiced the altered state of consciousness used by magicians to gain their deepest insights.
For Freud, this was a method of free association, and for Jung, this is a method of active imagination, where you deliberately induce a fantasy and you talk to aspects of yourself that are personified in image form. This would be like in the occult or in mediumship or in seances, thinking that you're talking to the dead when you're actually talking to yourself or your many inner selves.
While Freud had isolated the personality into a bundle of neuroses driven purely by sexual repression, Jung had brought the individual to higher ground, a place within a broader humanity that had meaning and continuity.
We have both a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious. So the personal unconscious is more aligned with our soul, And then our collective unconscious is the wisdom, the archetypes, the myths, the universalities that anybody can tap into. So we all have our own personal path that we're on, and we all have a collective path.
Jung's ideas have inspired many New Age practices.
Channeling might possibly come from something like Jung's collective unconscious. Probably most people who are channelers would say it comes from a higher level of wisdom. And maybe it's the same thing. It certainly is a related kind of concept to the collective unconscious. But the typical presentation is as if there's some being, a departed soul, or maybe a group of them who now exist in some other dimension, but have chosen to help us out by channeling some of their wisdom through one of your friends or neighbors.
In Jung's work, dreams could yield valuable insights. Some psychologists have taken this one step further into a technique called lucid dreaming.
Lucid dreams are a special category where not only are you dreaming, but you know you're dreaming, and you actually may even be able to directly influence the direction of the dream.
But Jung's influence did not stop with psychology. His work inspired a physicist who would try to forge a connection between the occult and science. For centuries, the study of the universe and the mind were separate disciplines. In 1905, the 30-year-old Jung met a young German man working as a clerk in a Swiss patent office, Albert Einstein. In some ways, Einstein was a mystic at heart. As a child, he had observed the movements of a compass needle and vowed that he would one day learn the mind of God. Like Newton, he would enter an altered state of consciousness which he called mind exercises, and intuitively arrive at his discoveries. Only later, Einstein would back them up with formulas and proofs. That year, Einstein published 5 papers of new physics in the journal Annalen der Physik, theories that rewrote the rules of the universe. In it, he posed his theory of relativity, which held that time and space are relative, changing concepts, not absolutes.
Newton developed these wonderful things, the laws of motion and gravity and so on, which appeared to be just like clockwork. And it made everybody pretty happy, even though it was revolutionary at its time, because they discovered that the universe was a big giant clock and it all worked in an orderly way. Einstein came along and said, well, yeah, that could be true, but also it's relative. And it turned it all upside down again.
In Einstein's autobiographical notes, he would ask Newton for forgiveness for revolutionizing the science of physics. Einstein had finally solved a contradiction Newton had observed an age ago in the behavior of light, that it acted like a wave, but sometimes like a particle. And in the process, he finally proved Newton's intuition about the existence of atoms.
The photoelectric effect, as it's called. If you shine a bright light onto a piece of metal, it'll knock electrons loose. And the wave theory was simply not accounting for the details of how that happened. Then came Einstein in 1905 and was able to account for the photoelectric effect perfectly by saying that when light interacts with the metal, it comes in discrete bundles of energy that depend only on the frequency of the light and not its intensity. So it's still a wave. I mean, frequency is fundamentally a wave concept, but it's acting like a particle.
Years later, Jung reported that Einstein's genius had influenced his entire body of intellectual work. And Einstein's photoelectric theory laid the foundation for the later contradictions of the subatomic world, quantum physics. Consciousness appeared to affect the universe.
Einstein had a very strong, basically philosophical conviction that a theory of physics should be complete, that if you know everything there is to know about a system, you can predict everything that it will do thenceforward.
In quantum physics, there is no absolute. Everything changes according to observation.
Einstein famously said that God does not play dice with the universe, and he repeated this often enough that one of his colleagues, the attribution varies, told him, would you stop telling God what to do?
Einstein rejected quantum physics, but quantum physics could not be ignored, and the concepts of the occult would help some understand this uncharted territory. To the new breed of quantum physicists, the mind itself played an integral role. How matter behaved depended completely on the observer.
The idea that physics, or that the physical reality is somehow a construct of the mind or is dependent on it, is certainly one of the ways that you can interpret quantum mechanics. And this is one of the reasons there's so much argument generated, because some people really like that idea and some people really hate it.
Quantum physicists call this the observer problem.
If only conscious beings can be observers, then we're intimately hooked in to the very existence of reality. Without us, there would just be this expanding superposition of possibilities with nothing definite ever actually happening.
15 years after Einstein published his groundbreaking papers, Wolfgang Pauli, barely out of his teens, wrote a brilliant exposition of Einstein's relativity theory. The two pioneers of quantum mechanics, Max Born and Niels Bohr, encouraged Pauli to join their field. These mind-numbing problems became Wolfgang Pauli's obsession. Though a difficult and troubled man, Pauli was a master of intention. Other scientists called it the Pauli effect.
His colleagues in the experimental laboratories in physics said, please, please stay away, because sure as he would arrive in the laboratory, all the experiments would stop working. They even claimed that if Pauli went by the town in a train, that the experiments would stop working. He, like many of the others we think of as great scientists, was consummate intender. He could intend what was about to happen, and it would happen in a certain sense. He was one of the most creative figures in quantum mechanics because of that.
Pauli, like Newton, fell deep into this work, and eventually he had a mental collapse. In 1948, he went to the newly created C.G. Jung Institute to seek help from the now famous psychologist. As he walked into the room, the Pauli effect occurred. A vase suddenly fell to the floor. Both men would later say that when the vase shattered, they recognized their destiny. Together, they would try to comprehend the universe using both physics and psychology.
Pauli became one of the great contributors to the development of quantum physics, partly because of the intuitions that were fed, at least in part, by that kind of collaboration with a great intuitive thinker in a completely different domain, Carl Jung. And similarly, Jung understood much more and was able to express more usefully the kinds of things that he knew because of Pauli's contributions.
The incident itself led them to develop the concept of synchronicity, where two supposedly random events collide to create meaning.
Synchronicity, as Jung defines it, is a correspondence between an inner psychic state, psychological state, and some external event. The correspondence having a high degree of improbability, so that it appears random or accidental or merely coincidental or merely chance.
Jung and Pauli combined their brilliance and intuition and arrived at a theory of the universe. If matter behaves according to observation, then have human beings made their own reality? Have people's collective thoughts and dreams created our world? It's a notion that many scientists reject, but it echoes the occult.
The ancient occultists' idea of a latent consciousness that's pervading the whole world would make some of the interpretations of quantum mechanics a great deal simpler, because if consciousness is essential to the act of observation, to bringing a definite reality out of these quantum clouds of probability, life in some ways gets simpler if there are other sources of consciousness out there besides just us.
The latest attempts to produce Einstein's unified field theory is string theory, which marries Newton's physics to quantum physics in a new theory of gravity. String theorists believe that at the smallest level imaginable, all matter is made up of vibrating strings. Those differences in observations in quantum physics are not due to the unconscious creating the universe, rather due to tiny variations in vibrations.
String theory unifies the small and the large. We have Einstein's theory of general relativity, which is a theory of the gravitational force, and it works very well at explaining the large scale of the universe. We have quantum mechanics, which is the theory of the very small, and it also works extremely well. The trouble is these theories are not compatible. You cannot construct a theory of quantum gravity by any of the conventional approaches. String theory looks extremely promising in that regard because it is innately a quantum theory.
If true, it implies a fascinating realm of parallel universes and multiple dimensions.
The way string theory does an elegant thing is that it says, okay, there are these tiny little things called strings, and they make up all other particles that there are in the whole universe. And these strings are really just energy. And therefore, we've now gotten down to the very, very tiniest particle or element of what there is. And then since they're all just energy, we can think of ourselves as merely energy, which would be very satisfying for many people. There's a religious way to see that, and there's a chemical way and a physical way to see that.
But these theories may never be proven. Scientists have affected our world with work that has at first appeared magical. In 1895, Conrad Röntgen was experimenting with cathode rays when he noticed a green glow on a painted screen on his workbench. But the cathode ray tube was covered with black paper, which meant that these invisible rays passed through a solid. Experimenting further, he discovered that the rays could pass through skin, revealing the bones of his wife's hand.
Imagine people's reaction to that. Imagine somebody told you, here's a table, and there's a drawer, and then inside it, there's some film, and I'm going to pass these mysterious rays through your hand, and you see your bones. Now, people would say that's supernatural, that's occult. In fact, nobody believed him. And he said, I'm not going to publish this in a scientific journal because it sounds almost occult. So in fact, I'm going to publish it in a newspaper. So he published it in his wife's hand in a newspaper, and you could see the bones of a hand, and it made history overnight.
Röntgen's work could have easily been dismissed.
Put yourself back at that time. Here are people talking about physics and balls moving, light and this and that, and somebody publishes a paper saying there are these rays that go through your hand, which is opaque, and show the skeleton, the bones of your hand. You'd have said, this is garbage. This is occult, okay? But it turned out it's not occult, it's a real phenomenon. But the difference is it was immediately repeated by 1,000 laboratories all over the world.
Will other occult beliefs become proven science? Originally from England, Margaret Barrett had little knowledge of the Civil War, but felt drawn to study it. One day she happened upon a picture of John Pelham and noticed a striking resemblance. The gallant Pelham, as he was known, was killed by a Union shell at the age of 24. Does he live on in Margaret?
Margaret suffers from chronic migraines. She's had brain surgery for what I believe is the same injury that John Pelham died from. John Pelham died when a shell exploded in the back of his head and pressed in his skull. And Margaret has had the same problem through which she's had brain surgery.
So what is to be made of Margaret's belief in the apparent connection between Pelham's death and her condition?
When I do a past life regression, the first thing I do is try and create a bridge. The bridge is some connection from the current life to a past life. It could be a fear, a phobia, it could be a job, a relationship. It really doesn't matter. Sometimes even had dreams turn into be bridges into the past life. So once I do a thorough history, then I start to hypnotize a person. So what we try and do with a past life regression is help people learn from their previous lives so they don't make the same mistakes in their current life.
Are we left with imprints of those who lived before us?
We have this action and intelligence at a distance. The thing is, we have to connect to it. We have to be conscious of this possibility.
Will discovering past lives someday be as commonplace as X-rays? Most scientists reject the idea.
In the case of Röntgen, you did the experiment, everybody could repeat it, we accept it. In the case of Galileo's small stone and big stone, any child can go and repeat it. But that's not always true. Let's take velocity of light, and Einstein said it's finite. It took very, very detailed quantitative experiments to prove that was correct. You can't just do it quickly. Maybe some of these phenomena are so elusive and so tiny that it's going to take ages to disprove. But this sounds like a cop-out to me. It just doesn't have a ring of truth. If you can't test a proposition, there's no way of testing it. It's not even part of our knowledge. It's as good as gibberish.
Some explain past lives as simple associations.
And you say, well, I have seen this before, and yet I couldn't have. How is that possible? Well, maybe it was my previous birth. That's the only way this could have happened. Because there's no way I could have met you, for example, prior to this evening, but I have this distinct feeling of having met you. How is that possible? Oh, maybe it was my previous birth. It's not your previous birth, it's your memory playing tricks on you.
Progress has long been achieved by innovators who were willing to go far beyond accepted reality.
In an interesting way, it almost seems that the evolution is really a kind of revolution, if you will. You sort of revolve through the same set of ideas, express them in different ways, find new tools for probing more deeply into the core understanding. But ultimately, we're looking at the same picture, the same universe, hopefully refining the understanding a bit, but we're working hand in hand with the ancient magicians.
Today, the mind is as mysterious as the universe once was. Will scientists one day discover that human beings create their own reality?
We're going to get some very big breakthroughs through science, but it's going to come by science looking at what some might call the occult. There's certain things that I find very interesting in New Age beliefs because I think they make explicit things that science just hasn't gotten to yet. I think everything that we don't have a scientific explanation for today, we will eventually have a scientific explanation for.
Only time will tell what breakthroughs are in store at the crossroads of science and the occult. Are there supernatural powers that can predict the future or influence events? Many who practice channeling, astrology, and tarot believe there are. Others have tried to offer proof. Among those who have claimed to have the power of the occult is Aleister Crowley. He believed that he could focus his mind and bend anyone to his will. One day in the 1920s, as he walked down a New York street, with his friend William Seabrook, he put his powers on display.
Seabrook asked for a demonstration of this. So Crowley pointed to a gentleman who was walking down the street and said, "Watch this." And Crowley then began to mimic the walk and the step of that person. And then Crowley suddenly dropped to a crouch and stood up again. And the person he was mimicking slipped and fell on the sidewalk. And then got up and looked for a banana peel or whatever and couldn't figure it out. And that was Crowley's demonstration of one of his newfound magical powers.
The story is legendary in occult circles, held as proof of a concept called action at a distance.
Occultists in general believe that they can affect things far away, whether they can divine them and see them far away, or whether they can actually influence things far away.
Magic
is both an art and a science. Certain things cause certain effects to happen. At the same time, they have to be done with a certain intention and perhaps a certain flair in order to work.
Was Crowley a master of 20th century occult magic, as some have claimed? His beliefs were nothing new. Crowley took his lead from the Egyptians, early occultists who believed that spells could heal the sick and make crops grow. Some things that seem supernatural can often become accepted fact. Sir Isaac Newton believed that an invisible force called gravity that held planets in orbit around the sun created action at a distance. Newton hesitated to share his groundbreaking theory of gravity for fear that it would be branded as magic.
Science nowadays really is touching against ideas dealing with where magic and spirituality and religion intersect. And they're both ways of trying to find out about how the world works.
The occult means secret or hidden, and its early masters were regarded as true magicians, but they were also the first scientists. Their discoveries in the occult arts of astrology and alchemy gave birth to modern scientific disciplines.
You go back to ancient times, there was no science. So the magicians and the alchemists and the proto-mathematicians, they were doing science, but they were also doing literature and philosophy and cosmology and religion, and there was no sorting out of those things. Since the birth of what we would call modern science, science and the occult have sort of separated the paths.
Many still view the occult with suspicion, but modern science is often working on the edge of the supernatural, trying to solve mysteries that confronted the first magicians.
Serious physicists are contemplating time travel. Serious physicists are contemplating parallel universes. Serious physicists are trying to understand the 11 dimensions of string theory. And when you get into those realms, you start to look to myth and sort of magical thinking and almost surreal thinking as a way to even talk about those things.
Were the early occult masters keepers of secrets that modern science is only beginning to rediscover? The trail of the occult begins in Egypt 5,000 years ago. Just before the rise of Egypt's great pharaohs, hieroglyphics or pictographs were invented. Egyptians used them to document their history and religion, and to practice complex systems of astronomy, astrology, and geometry. They believed their powerful knowledge came from the god Thoth.
Thoth, or Tahuti, was the Egyptian god of magic. And more than just the god of magic, he was the god of writing, of astronomy, of mathematics and science. He invented language, invented writing.
Only priests with special training were allowed access to Thoth's sacred knowledge. Imhotep, builder of the first pyramid, was one of the chosen.
Thoth was considered to be the one who gave us writing and numbers and the arts of self-cultivation through works of consciousness. Some people thought he was a person who was then deified through his accomplishments. Other people feel that this has been a mythical entity from the beginning.
Legends held that a book of magic written by Thoth contained the secrets of the gods.
The Book of Thoth was actually considered to be in the astral plane. Not a physical thing, but something that you had to actually travel in consciousness to arrive at. And so this is probably one of those very old incidences of channeling where an individual would get into a special state of mind, contact the Thoth energy wherever it was to be found, and then be tutored by this multilingual, multi-code kind of consciousness.
If you were to describe the Book of Thoth, you could also, look at a building like the pyramid or the Sphinx and say that the teachings contained therein are pages within the Book of Thoth. So all measurement, all words, all concepts are part of the Book of Thoth.
But no Book of Thoth has ever been found. The god is said to have buried it beneath the Nile and protected its secrets with a deadly curse. Modern archaeologists eventually discovered that the Babylonians had created much of the knowledge Egyptians credited to Thoth. As early as 4000 BC, they were the first to measure planetary movements. They invented the abacus, the first sequential numeric system, and some of the earliest forms of astrology and astronomy. This information spread to Egypt and helped launch one of history's greatest cultures. And like the Egyptians, the Babylonians regarded their knowledge as divine.
Every temple was an observatory. It was actually an astronomical site for watching the planets. The whole concept of divining means trying to understand the will of the gods. And in order to understand the will of the gods, you have to have something to read about them, something that you see they're doing.
The Babylonians used one of the occult's oldest arts to understand their world, divination, or accessing the supernatural.
The movements of the planets through the heavens used to be considered the footprints of the gods and goddesses. And when they would catch up with each other and have interactions, or one would go retrograde and then go forward again, these things were all understood to affect the world.
It began in the Stone Age, when shamans invoked the spirits to ensure the success of the hunt.
Certain people who were distinguishable by early man as having sort of mystical experiences, and these would be the religious representatives of the clan. These people would have been communicating in ways of imagination to kind of talk to the gods or talk to the spirits or affect certain things that would happen.
In Egypt, divination developed into a sophisticated system of rituals and ceremonies designed to contact the gods who ruled their world.
Of course, you were trying to influence things like your success in business or the crops. The Egyptians used rituals, they used incantations, they used symbols to convey all of those things. The pharaoh himself was the head of their religion, so that he was probably the chief practitioner of both their religion and their magic.
Much of what is called ceremonial magic, the casting of spells, the use of magic words and incantations, came from the Egyptians. When Phoenician traders spread this knowledge throughout the Mediterranean world, magic became practical.
They codified an alphabet that would line up the sounds of speech, the number canon, and the zodiacal signs, planets, and features in the heavens, so that you could, with this alphabet, spell sacred words. You could also count and figure and calculate, and you could also do astronomy.
The sacred origins of these disciplines were gradually forgotten. In 1212 BC, Ramses II, the last great pharaoh of Egypt, died. Invading armies conquered the land of the Nile. Its occult secrets were lost, but not forever. After the decline of Egypt's extraordinary culture, another civilization rose, Greece in the 6th century BC. It was aided by one of the most probing minds in history, Pythagoras. Our alphabet, the buildings that surround us, even the music we hear, owes a debt to this brilliant philosopher. In his pursuit of wisdom, Pythagoras traveled broadly, searching for lost occult knowledge. He found it in the mystery schools scattered throughout many different cultures. Pythagoras synthesized the elements of these teachings into a new discipline, philosophy. Its foundation, numbers.
He believed that mathematics and philosophy and an understanding of the divine all went together.
We can't say he originated anything, but he condensed and boiled down the knowledge of the world and then brought it to a practical application.
Pythagoras identified numbers as the most fundamental elements of creation.
As we look at science in this day and age, we're finding that the whole world is filled with these mathematical constants. You've got pi, you've got the speed of light, you've got the force of gravitation. So the idea that numbers describe the world seems to be the case.
In 518 BC, Pythagoras opened a school in the Croton region of southern Italy. His carefully selected disciples were called mathematicoi. Their initiation was rigorous. 3 introductory years, followed by 5 years of absolute silence, then 5 more of training. Only then were students ready to learn the most sacred mysteries of numbers.
He wanted to produce philosophers like himself, so you had to be very circumspect, you had to be very self-controlled to be able to even be in his school.
Pythagoras turned the numbering system of the Babylonians into a sacred science.
They believed that number was like God, And to connect with this was to be talking to God. And so from that arises a whole lot of symbolism that later becomes numerology, Kabbalah, things like that.
Pythagoras discovered that the mystery schools shared the belief that all of creation was at one with God.
He did a huge amount of explaining sacred mathematics by showing how the 1 splits and becomes 2, the 2 finds a synthesis and becomes 3, the 3 breaks open and becomes the 10,000 things. And that same story you read in the I Ching, you read in other metaphysical ancient documents, because everybody was trying to understand, how do we get number out of all?
Many credit Pythagoras and his school with the development of numerology and the efficient Greek alphabet eventually adopted by much of Western culture. Pythagoras also applied numbers to decode music, which Greeks regarded as the language of the gods. He invented the monochord, which defined the numerical ratios of the musical scale. Pythagoras believed he had solved the mysteries of the universe.
But there was also this idea that there was a music of the spheres, that the heavens itself was playing a sort of orchestral piece.
The planets themselves stack up around the sun at harmonic intervals. White light breaks out into color at harmonic intervals. Sound is also harmonically, the harmonic sequence that comes out of any given note, those nodes of overtones are all governed by the same mathematics. So it was Pythagoras who articulated harmonic math to the West.
Ultimately, the exclusivity of Pythagoras' school caused its downfall. In 508 BC, the school was burned to the ground.
There was a point at which his schools were attacked and destroyed and some of his followers killed. Pythagoras himself left and went off into the countryside and died, and no one really knows what happened. Some people think that he committed suicide, but it's a mystery. No one's really sure.
The society was hounded into extinction. Generations of later Greeks built upon Pythagoras' philosophy, and Aristotle turned it into science. But then came Christianity, and for the next 1,000 years, religion cast a long shadow over science and the occult. During the first 15 centuries of Christianity, occult knowledge was driven underground.
When the Judeo-Christian consolidation of Western spirituality became the enforced model, magic was really moved way off to the sidelines and became a dark and forbidden subject.
Priests were the intermediaries between people and the divine. Christianity also wielded unparalleled political influence.
The church had developed a hierarchy. It had developed the idea that the Pope took his word from God and then passed that down to the rest. And the church had also cemented itself with certain monarchs.
The church closely guarded its exclusive access to divine authority.
Like every other in-crowd group, if everybody can do it, then you can't claim that your guys are, special.
For centuries, Western Europe lived largely under church control.
In the Middle Ages, magic became a rebellious act perpetrated almost as an anti-Christian or an anti-authoritarian type of behavior.
The church singled out occultists, condemning them because they believed that an individual could have direct access to God.
They took the whole concept of church hierarchy, priests, the church itself, as a place of worship and said, no, you don't need any of this stuff. What you need is to work on discovering within yourself that divine spark.
But in the 14th century, the occult would rise again. Ironically, the church's holy war, the Crusades, was in part responsible. Monasteries to the east on the border of the Muslim world had preserved many of the ancient Greek and occult texts, studying them as curiosities. Returning crusaders brought a number of these documents back to Europe with them.
This learning started to trickle back, and little things were found in monasteries, a bit of scripture here, a bit of text there. And so the rumors were around that there had been greater learning in the past.
This rediscovery fueled an extraordinary rebirth of culture.
Well, this was the point people began to realize, oh, there was wisdom amongst the ancients.
You have a new reverence for Egyptian and Greek and Roman and Hebraic tradition, because people are looking for really empowering knowledge and looking to understand the secrets of the ancients.
Art and science swept through Western Europe in the 1400s as it ushered in the Renaissance. Leading the movement into new ways of looking at old knowledge was the German physician Paracelsus. Born in Germany in 1493, Paracelsus trained in traditional medicine but also studied alchemy. Ultimately, forced out of school for challenging the status quo, he embarked on a nomadic life supporting himself with astrology readings. In his far-flung travels, he sought knowledge from any source he could find.
Paracelsus went around Europe and talked to barbers, talked to witches, talked to midwives, talked to, the village healer, and gathered together from everywhere what worked. And this was his huge final stance, is I use what works.
He rejected outworn theories, ventured beyond accepted boundaries. His pioneering experiments with minerals and chemicals laid the foundation for modern medicine. It was just the beginning of a scientific revolution. The next century would herald the discovery of an occult text that went against more than tradition. It was a threat to the power of the church. The Renaissance brought about a new spirit of learning, and academies sprung up throughout Europe. In the 15th century, Marsilio Ficino founded one of Italy's most progressive. With the support of his patron, Cosimo Medici, Ficino acquired and translated a collection of documents reputedly authored by a mysterious Egyptian magician named Hermes Trismegistus.
An emissary from the Orthodox Church brought a cache of documents, and Ficino found, I think it was 12 books supposedly written by Hermes. They weren't necessarily all written as one book, but they were gathered together once these translations were made.
The documents, which became known as the Hermeticum, contained teachings from the early Christian era that had been lost for centuries. Their pedigree appeared to be impeccable. The name of their supposed author, the mysterious Hermes Trismegistus, was a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, the two greatest gods of Greek and Egyptian magic.
There was occultism in there. There were esoteric doctrines. There was alchemy. There was magic. There was astrology. And Ficino and his school considered these documents to be extremely old, predating Plato, in fact, and having come from Egypt.
Scholars would determine that the man Hermes Trismegistus never existed.
What Ficino was translating was a compendium of Greek lore about how an individual could cultivate themselves and become enlightened, raising of a given individual's consciousness until they are like the gods.
The books were set up as a series of dialogues between the god Hermes and others who conveyed the secrets of the universe. One of the documents was a short piece called the Emerald Tablet, which became the Bible of Renaissance occultists.
On this tablet, it was said, these are all legends, that there were 12 or 13 lines, and these lines started with "as above, so below." This was the great idea of the pattern of the universe, the pattern of the stars and the great universe is repeated as well on the earth.
The Hermeticum restated the teaching of the early mystery schools, that human beings possessed a divine nature.
So this is really the goal of Hermetic initiation and any other kind of initiation, would be to transcend our mortality and put us back into our ultimate state as spiritual peers.
The Hermeticum dazzled Renaissance scholars, and occultism was reborn. Could the idea that human beings shared a direct link to God undermine the authority of the church? The discovery of the Hermeticum during the Renaissance created a new generation of occultists. They sought to combine religion with science and magic, a dangerous undertaking in a society ruled by Christianity. John Dee would risk his life to study its teachings.
John Dee was a giant. John Dee was the embodiment of the ideal of an enlightened being who had the spiritual understanding of his role and mission in life, and who was gifted with, superior intelligence.
But like Pythagoras, he would pay a heavy price for daring to seek out the wisdom of the gods. The ultimate Renaissance man, Dee followed in the footsteps of Paracelsus, using experimentation to become a gifted scientist, an inventor, a mathematician, a brilliant cryptographer, and a pioneer in the field of navigation.
But he was also an occultist, he was a sorcerer, he was an astrologer. He was, in fact, Queen Elizabeth's personal court astrologer. And in that sense, his interests were all very much in keeping with the thinking of the time. There wasn't a distinction made between magic and science, and he was pursuing an understanding of the world around him.
When Queen Elizabeth rose to the throne of England in 1558, she installed Dee as court astrologer, but his influence reached far beyond his position. England's famous magician was also a spy for the Queen.
He was involved with political intrigue. He was a trusted ally of the Queen, but he was also working behind the scenes throughout Europe to help to lower the power of the church and to substitute Protestant power in its stead.
With Dee's guidance, Queen Elizabeth officially legitimized the most significant occult science of the Renaissance, alchemy. Alchemists had two goals: to heal illness and to turn base metal into gold. They believed success could be achieved by finding the Philosopher's Stone, a mystical agent that would also produce a higher level of consciousness in the alchemist.
That was really an approach to trying to understand the way the physical world works, and alchemy as a practice, was the forefather of modern chemistry.
Alchemy had existed since the early Egyptians, but in the hands of the Renaissance scientists, it reached new heights.
Everything that we know and do today in our modern science was developed by the alchemists. Laboratory techniques were part of the alchemical tradition. The observation of results, the scientific method is a child of alchemy.
Alchemists were on the leading edge of science. They discovered phosphorus, zinc, the distillation of alcohol, the germ nature of diseases. They were the first to understand how blood circulates in the body. The church viewed their unorthodox experiments and scientific breakthroughs with growing suspicion.
We are speeding up what nature does. We're speeding up the rate at which the metals evolve. We're speeding up the rate at which medicines are combined and raise consciousness. And the church felt that you can't be speeding up God's creation without recourse to demons.
Despite his work in alchemy, Dee's true occult passion lay in divination. He believed that he could apply scientific methods to communicate with supernatural beings. Dee's obsession with contacting the angels would have disastrous consequences. This art of manipulating objects like bones, tea leaves, and tarot cards had arrived from the Muslim East in the 14th century and become a popular method of fortune-telling. But Dee used a divination method known as scrying. Dee relied on looking into a crystal ball that would reflect back supernatural information.
Scrying is a long-time-old technique, scrying into glasses, mirrors, bodies of water, anything that would have a reflective surface, and see if you could see not just the material things, but the spiritual things standing behind.
Dee's efforts were unsuccessful until one day a young man named Edward Kelly appeared at his door. Kelly seemed to have the talent to see into the shadow world.
Their system involved Edward Kelly looking into a amethyst crystal and describing what he saw, and John Dee would then record these communications.
Kelly began receiving messages from the angels. They spoke in a language he called Enochian, from the lost biblical book of Enoch. These transmissions are early examples of what New Age followers now call channeling.
What Dee and Kelly brought forth was completely new. It was not based on tradition.
He appeared to be speaking a new language.
The Enochian language does appear to have a coherent vocabulary and syntax, and this doesn't seem like the sort of thing that Kelly, who was not a particularly educated or schooled person, could have just invented. He couldn't have faked something like that.
John Dee and Kelly embarked on a tour of Europe to share their discoveries, just as the Inquisition launched another crackdown against heretics.
All you needed was a slight change in political or religious circumstance, and something that was considered exceptionally wonderful would then be considered demonic and scary.
Dee returned home to England to find that a mob had destroyed his irreplaceable library and scientific and occult instruments. Dee had fallen out of favor with the court. The man who began as a leading scientist of the Renaissance ended his life penniless, branded as a sorcerer.
Dee's main legacy was not to science, it is to magic. And it's because of those who have come after, who have seized upon what he created and made it into a new worldview, whether it's consciousness arts or ceremonial magic or divination, could take place inside these new parameters that they set up.
John Dee's fall was the beginning of the occult's end. The practices were reviled by the church as the work of demonic possession. From the 14th through the 16th century, more than 40,000 people would be executed for witchcraft. Occult ideas became embedded in the traditions of secret societies, such as the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians.
They were tending to do them passed on among secret brotherhoods and organizations because these are very powerful and dangerous ideas, dangerous to status quo, dangerous to institutionalized religion. So there's an element of underground secrecy associated with some of these themes.
These havens of safety began to flourish across Europe. Secret societies were instrumental in the new age of enlightenment that swept through Europe in the 1700s and even helped in the founding of American democracy. Participation in these organizations had fallen dramatically by the mid-1800s as they became more civic-minded and less interested in the occult. So what would cause a resurgence in the occult? In rural New York, two unlikely sisters would inspire a national obsession with the occult. Magic would once again capture imaginations. On March 31st, 1848, Sisters Leah and Margaret Fox publicly declared that they had contacted spirits from beyond the grave. An American fascination for communicating with the dead occurred almost overnight. The Fox sisters used a technique called a seance, which quickly became one of America's most popular pastimes. People gathered in a darkened room while a medium tried to make contact with the spirit world.
There would be tambourines and other bells that would sound, and the medium would actually be able to exude, ectoplasm from their nostrils or their mouth, and it was this sort of spiritual substance that allowed the spirits of the dead to manifest and appear. And in other cases, the medium would simply become a conduit or a channel through which the deceased were able to speak.
Many who practiced spiritualism believed it would lead to scientific proof of the existence and immortality of the soul. And they gained an iconic champion when the Russian-born Madame Blavatsky arrived in New York at the height of spiritualism's popularity. She soon became the self-proclaimed decoder of ancient occult secrets.
She grew up in a wonderful occult library that her father had established. She could see the connections between different cultures, spiritual teachings, and she was attempting to correct the errors of Christianity by bringing in mysticism and spirituality from other cultures.
Born in the Ukraine in 1831 to a lower-ranking nobleman, Blavatsky was married early, but she abandoned her husband to spend 10 years traveling the world. She claimed to have studied with mystical adepts in India and Tibet. The exotic cigar-smoking medium became a sensation in the occult circles.
She just wouldn't accept limits. She was one of the most educated person anybody who met her had ever met. And they couldn't understand, how could this powerful intellect be in this female body, just chewing up the landscape and producing this tremendous inspiration?
Blavatsky's seances were the talk of New York. Mysterious letters would appear, written by spiritual leaders she called the Great White Brotherhood.
Blavatsky was not above taking advantage of the popularity of seances to push her own cause, and she used these seances to very spectacular effect to materialize letters written by these ascended masters as instructions being passed down to her.
The Brotherhood dictated to her the books that became the foundation of a new science of mysticism, theosophy.
Blavatsky wrote essentially two gigantic collections, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, which purported to be the teachings, the secret teachings of this kind of Eastern brotherhood, the mystery schools of initiation. And she totally altered the spiritual landscape of Western civilization by introducing those concepts.
She was very much a pioneer in bringing ideas of Eastern esotericism into the West. She focused on the similarities between Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism and other spiritual traditions, arguing that there is in fact a tradition that underlies all spiritual faiths in the world.
Blavatsky regarded her work as spiritual science and made connections between recent scientific advancements and occult beliefs. Blavatsky promoted the ancient Eastern mystical view that the essential nature of the world was not matter, but energy, which foreshadowed the discoveries of modern physics. Blavatsky also revived the Eastern beliefs in reincarnation and karma. Quickly acquiring a cult following, she launched the Theosophy Society.
The term theosophy, which Blavatsky coined, really comes from two words. They're of Greek origin. One is theos, which means God, and Sophia, which means wisdom. So the Theosophical Society was teaching divine or sacred wisdom.
The Theosophical Society spread internationally and still exists in many countries. Blavatsky was hailed by her followers as the mother of the New Age. But for all of Blavatsky's charisma, she soon fell victim to her own success.
And at the time that she was becoming famous, this business of spiritualism and channeling, and especially seances where you'd call up your dead ancestors, that was going all over the Western world, and she felt like that was charlatanism. So she wanted to represent a model that stepped outside of that and spoke to the verities, the truths, the larger things. But unfortunately, in the end, she got reduced down to the very thing she was trying to fight.
In 1885, Blavatsky was investigated by London's Society for Psychical Research. It concluded that her seances were rigged. Writings didn't magically come from beyond the grave.
There was a spring-loaded device in the bedroom above her chamber that allowed someone to put a letter into this device and have it drop down between the floorboards and materialize in their hands.
Though many devoted followers refused to abandon theosophy, Blavatsky was now tainted with fraud. She died soon afterwards. Her followers established a new headquarters in India where theosophy thrived. A young protege, Krishnamurti, was identified as a reincarnated master and groomed to lead the Theosophy Society into the 20th century. Blavatsky's synthesis of Eastern and Western spirituality broke new ground in occultism. A man described by newspapers as the most wickedest man alive claimed he had penetrated even deeper into mysteries. Born in 1875, Aleister Crowley was raised in a strict religious household. His mother nicknamed him the Beast from the Book of Revelation. It was a title he embraced his entire life.
He identified himself as the Antichrist, as the force that would take away this terrible Christian program which had so warped his childhood.
Crowley began studying the occult as a member of the Golden Dawn.
The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was the secret society par excellence of the Victorian age in England. It brought together, again, the knowledge that was available at that point in time. So you had tarot, and you had Kabbalah, and you had John Dee's angelic magic and Rosicrucian traditions all being melded together under a single system.
The Golden Dawn attracted many of the London intelligentsia. Crowley, though, ultimately broke away from the group. He would find his own system of belief after a trip to Egypt, where his wife received a mystical signal that told him to prepare himself for a message from the gods. Heeding the call, he began spontaneously writing a book he called the Book of the Law.
This book announces a new law for mankind. And in fact, it tells us that we are very emboldened and brightened spiritual entity, that in fact, we are as the gods.
The Book of the Law was another synthesis of Eastern and Western spirituality. Crowley called his new system the Lema. It incorporated principles of magic that he said he had learned from ancient Egyptian and other occult sources. He became a self-proclaimed master of action at a distance, focusing the power of his intention or will to create desired effects.
Aleister Crowley defined magic as the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with the will. And his whole approach is basically to empower the practitioner to make their intentions happen, to materialize what they want to have happen in the world.
The Lema's fundamental law was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will." While this may have meant pursuing a higher path for some, for others, it excused every variety of deviant behavior. Some critics claim that Crowley himself was one of its worst offenders.
Crowley was practicing sexuality as a spiritual path. He reduced a great deal of symbolic teachings to their essence, which is essentially the duality or the polarity between male and female. And he experimented greatly within that sphere to understand what mysteries were contained within the sexual act.
Crowley went on to start his own secret society, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and wrote numerous books about meditation and ceremonial magic. He also helped reinterpret tarot for the 20th century.
The tarot is a pictorial representation of occult teachings. It's a method of going within and contacting archetypal levels within oneself, spiritual levels, and entering meditative state in which intuition is heightened and maybe even, where you can see certain patterns developing because you're in the right state of mind.
While popularized by Italian noblemen in the 1300s as playing cards, some say tarot's origins date to ancient Egypt. Over time, they acquired occult significance. Crowley developed a deck of his own called the Book of Thoth, based on the Egyptian magic he had studied. A popular divination tool today, tarot is said to reveal information about the seeker and the questions about his future.
Everything that's related in one moment of time is all connected. So if two people come together around a question and they're manipulating an oracular tool like this, but if that manipulation is intended to serve the need and the feeling, then it will make a mirroring reflection of the energy that's produced between the two people.
Crowley's writings, like Madame Blavatsky's, were heralded as forerunners of many New Age ideas. But despite his serious work in occultism, ultimately he became infamous for his use of drugs and decadent sexual behavior. As Hitler rose to power in the 1930s, Crowley's reputation was fatally damaged. He wrote pro-Nazi propaganda and was soon an outcast. After World War II, it was rumored that Hitler had used Crowley's and Madame Blavatsky's writings to help him create his theory of a master race.
I don't think there's any evidence that Hitler read the works of Aleister Crowley per se. It's definitely known that Hitler and members of his regime had a very keen interest in the occult, and they adopted the trappings of occult symbolism.
Ill and addicted to opium, Crowley spent his final days in a boarding house and died in 1947. Like other occultists before him, Crowley attempted to learn the secrets of the gods, only to be discredited and condemned by society.
I think that in the cases of these great thinkers in history that we see ultimately being persecuted for their beliefs, what's happening there is that these people are very forward-thinking and they challenge our preconceptions. They make people uncomfortable. From that level of discomfort and that level of fear and that threat that thinking has to people's power base, that leads societies and governments and other institutions to act against people who speak out in that way.
Once again, occultism seemed to disappear. It would take the drugs, rebellion, and social upheaval of the 1960s to usher in its next revival. Occult practices languished on the fringes of society for most of the 20th century, but they resurfaced during the hippie movement of the 60s. Popular gurus like the Maharishi and Timothy Leary promoted altered states of consciousness that could lead to higher levels of self-awareness. Individualism became the goal of millions of young people who rejected traditional religion to find their own direct route to God. By the 1980s, New Age ideas had become mainstream. Madame Blavatsky's writings became pivotal in reinterpreting occultism for modern audiences, and even Aleister Crowley's reputation was somewhat restored.
There was this boom in occult interest that resulted in Crowley being almost a pop culture icon. The Beatles put Aleister Crowley on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. You have musicians like David Bowie and Jimmy Page becoming very interested in Crowley. He experienced a renaissance, as it were, in the 60s and 70s and has been a very popular figure ever since.
Occult belief systems are now embraced by millions of New Age followers who pick and choose from their wide array of concepts to fashion their own individual brand of spirituality. Yet the occult is still often regarded with suspicion. Many of those who practice occultism describe it as a modern mystical quest.
The mystical quest is the process by which a limited, time-space-bound human being can transcend their background and history and come into this divinized or macrocosmic consciousness. And that is the process of becoming immortal. You know, leaving this physical flesh behind and being successively identified with larger and larger realms of reality.
The holistic philosophy of New Age beliefs continues to grow in popularity.
We're surrounded by material wealth and technology, and we feel like we've lost something. We've lost that connectedness. We've lost the understanding of our human roots. And a lot of the interest in New Age ideas and a lot of the look back to ancient ideas stems from that desire to reconnect with that history and to make us feel more whole, more spiritual, more connected, more aware of the passion and meaning of life around us.
But what began as occult magic has informed the world of science.
There were attempts, legitimate attempts, to try to understand the way the world works. And there would not be astronomy today if it had not been for the ancient astrologers who studied the heavens. There would not be chemistry today if it weren't for the alchemists who did their thing as well.
Some of the secrets that they thought they were working on were the secret of eternal life, the secret of being able to be without disease, then the great secrets of transformation, let's say, of lead into gold, but that's like not the only one. Maybe one of the transformations is the human being into a godlike thing. And it's a wonderful thing that now we come around to particle physics and people thinking that life is pure energy and that maybe there is a connection between those ideas, that maybe the power to become godlike is in the ability to transform yourself.
Medicine and science have benefited from the input of occultism. And in the future, what we think of as magic may play a role in even greater discoveries.
In our push to science, we're a culture of specialists, very focused on particular areas. So I think some of that holistic nature from the past is necessary to make the breakthroughs that we are currently not able to make in science.
Beliefs can blind us, whether they're religious beliefs or scientific beliefs. And the great thing about these occult sorts of experiments is that they keep us open to possibility.
Despite the progress made by science, the modern world is still full of mysteries that may never be solved.
It's the unknowable, it's the mystery. And that mystery is the center of the spiritual quest. But it's also the center of the scientific quest and the artistic quest. That is what we're here on Earth to do, is seek after that mystery.
Like the first occultists, modern scientists will continue to search for ways to divine the mysteries of our world and the forces that have created them.